Welcome to another episode of Mobile Technology Spotlight, sponsored by Samsung Electronics and presented by Public Safety Insight. Samsung is committed to supporting public safety and helping agencies leverage technology, data, and innovative solutions to better serve their communities, including tackling one of the toughest challenges today, recruiting and retaining police officers. I'm Scott Hogue, and I'm joined today by two incredible guests. First, we have Colin Whittington, the CEO of Recruiting Heroes LLC, a nationally recognized expert helping law enforcement officers and veterans successfully transition into fulfilling careers, while also advising agencies on innovative strategies to attract and retain top talent. And second, we have Keith Redlin, the head of public sector and safety at Samsung Electronics, and current Reserve Deputy Sheriff at Oakland County Sheriff's Office, bringing experience on how technology can support recruitment, retention, and overall officer safety wellness. Welcome to both of you. I'm really looking forward to this discussion today. And as we get started, one of the things we hear as we talk with agencies all over the country is we're struggling recruiting and we're struggling retaining employees. So I think this topic is very, very important for agencies right now where they're just struggling to hire officers. So Colin, could you, thanks for joining us first, and could you start by just sharing a little bit about your background, your career in public safety, and what led you to starting Recruiting Heroes?
Thank you so much, Scott, for having me on. Thank you, Public Safety Insight. Thank you, Samsung. Really honored to be here with you all. As you mentioned, I come from a law enforcement background myself. I served about 8 years as a deputy sheriff for the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office, which is the largest sheriff's office in Virginia. Was honored to work on patrol, community policing as the agency's PIO. And then finally, I was promoted to sergeant and put in charge of the agency's employment services section, which oversaw recruiting and background investigations and hiring. And that's where I really fell in love with recruiting and realized I had a passion for it. During my career, I had a lot of successes, got named the 2019 Deputy Sheriff of the Year for the whole state of Virginia, a couple of Lifesaver Awards, and a few other honors as well. I had a great career, really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, like a lot of young officers today, I was one of, not victims, but one of the people that ended up leaving law enforcement after only 8 years and going into the private sector. And we'll talk about that throughout today's episode, and how my story is pretty common with what I'm seeing with other officers who are leaving within the first couple of years of their career. I ended up going to the private sector and then starting my business as a side hustle, and the business Recruiting Heroes. And what we're all about is two very different things, but still related at the same time. One of them is helping law enforcement agencies with their recruiting and with their retention efforts. And then the other side of the business is helping law enforcement officers who have finished their years of service, whether it be after a 20 or 30-year career, or like myself, after only a handful of years, helping those officers find success in their life and career after law enforcement as well. So very excited to be here and talk about these very important topics today.
Colin, thanks for sharing that. We hear a lot about the recruitment side of things, but it's very, it's unique in the side that you talk about where officers, they're in law enforcement, they decide to leave for one reason or another. Now, what do I do? And so it's a great niche that you've got to be able to help those heroes that have, left the agency and want to go do something else. Keith, could you take just a little bit of time and just talk to us a little bit about what you do? And by the way, thank you so much to Samsung for supporting this podcast today and this thought leadership discussion.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I'm excited to be on this call with Colin and you today as well, Scott. The relationship that Colin and I have, wow, Colin, we go back now at least over a year as we approach IACP in Denver. I remember, first of all, I saw your book online, the book that caught my attention, which is Beyond the Thin Blue Line, the mission that you had in there, the assistance, the support. If you recall, we had you out at IACP Boston, we had your book signing. And to me, it's always been about like that mission of service before self. What more can you do? In my role, I get to kind of, translate the badge into the boardroom. And with my 19 years in law enforcement as a reserve, former full-time, but, it has allowed me to understand and be connected to the law enforcement space and understand that, hey, listen, while I may be leading the public sector for Samsung, in the business world, it's still having my toes dipped in and touching technology and seeing what sheriff offices my sheriff office is doing here in Michigan, but having the unique experience to go and actually touch about 300 different agencies in the U.S. on an annual basis. That's about our reach here at Samsung. I hear what you just echoed, and that is a lot of my clients are like, "Hey, Keith, think of me when when I'm retiring in a couple of years," or "Hey, how do I get into your space? How do I translate that?" So I'm really excited for today's episode as well. Colin, great to reconnect with you as well.
Thank you, Keith. It was great meeting you last year in Boston, and I really love our relationship and our friendship we built over the year, a little over a year now. And then also just seeing how much Samsung cares about it, the public safety officers and law enforcement officers is truly amazing. They bought a couple hundred copies of my book so that I could hand them out for free at IACP last year in Boston. So it speaks highly of what Samsung is trying to do and the efforts they make to help our first responders.
Great. Thanks for both of you again for being here. Colin, I want to start with you with this sort of, I just made this statement, but I want to ask this question. So nationwide agencies are struggling to recruit and also retain officers. From your perspective, as you talk with agencies all over the country, what's driving these staffing challenges right now, and how has it evolved over the last few years?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love the fact that you brought up retention as well, because I think the 90% of the focus goes towards recruiting, when in fact, I've mentioned in my book and other places as well, in my opinion, retention is actually more important than recruiting. Unfortunately, agencies nowadays are losing officers in record numbers. Ever since COVID and the George Floyd era, the already difficult career of law enforcement has become more challenging, and seeing young officers leave has become a really huge topic. And it's something that I've really noticed in my business. The second half of my business, which I mentioned, was helping officers transition. My assumption was that the majority of officers I would be helping would be retirees. Last year, 65% of the candidates I worked with were those leaving within the first 10 or 12 years of service, deciding to leave early. I always liken it to pouring water into a bucket. You could pour as much water into a bucket as you want, but if there's a giant hole at the bottom, you'll never fill up that bucket. So I'm seeing agencies dumping a ton of money and resources into recruiting and maybe not putting the extra effort into retention that they need. But as far as the recruiting side of things goes, I do think a huge part of the issue is that agencies are currently being led by officers who joined the profession in the late 90s, early 2000s, back when there were 200 candidates applying for one law enforcement officer position. And they grew up in a time where, when the rookie officers may not have been treated perfectly well. They may have been treated like a number. There was always someone to replace them. And now these people are taking over the leadership roles and either consciously or subconsciously leading their recruiting efforts in the same exact manner. They're trying to recruit in the way that we did in the 90s or early 2000s. But nowadays, we're trying to recruit, for the most part, Gen Zers. And you're basically using strategies that we did for Generation X and whatever else. They're not landing the same way with this younger generation. This younger generation really cares about being in an environment where they feel valued. They really care about work-life balance and making a difference in their agency, in their community. And I see nonstop agencies, just every single ad I see is just the sign-on bonus. That's all they're ever advertising is, this is our sign-on bonus. This is it. And 95% of the ad is about the sign-on bonus and not talking about the specialties that they can go into, the work-life balance, the shifts, and things like that. And that is a huge issue. Just throwing money at the problem isn't going to solve it. So it's absolutely an issue with the recruiting side of things, but then also the retention is just as important, if not more so.
You touched on sort of the next question I had, but maybe I wanted to dig just a little bit deeper. When you talk about that this generation is looking for something different than previous generations, it used to be, when I started in law enforcement, you rode the brand. You were, like you said, there was someone else waiting for the job. If you didn't want to do it, you rode the brand and you just made it work. But today, that's different. And you talked about, special duties that are exciting, different shifts. People now, instead of overtime, many of them want to have time off with their families. What are you seeing that this generation wants that is different from the way it was 10, 15, 20 years ago?
Yeah, and I think this is a difference that is honestly in every single industry, not just law enforcement, but is absolutely hitting law enforcement probably the hardest. is that the older generation, they live to work. This younger generation, they work to live. They want to have that time off. They want to be with their families, but they also want to advance in their career. The days of somebody staying with one organization and staying at one level are well behind us. For the most part, people don't want to just go into patrol and stay there for 25 years. They want to get into recruiting or into investigations or into being a PIO or other things. And agencies have to make a real effort to show people what their options are with their agency. If all you show is, oh, you can work on patrol and this is your take-home cruiser, that may not be enough to really attract a younger generation that's really motivated to do more with their life. Not that there's anything wrong with being a patrol officer, but these young kids are looking beyond that already as well. And of course, everyone has to pay their dues, but you do have to make the extra effort to show them that they have more potential with the organization, that they will have a chance to have a difference or make a difference and have a say in the organization and not just be ignored because they're the newest officer. That isn't going to work with this younger generation. And we're seeing in the private sector as well that the loyalty to one company is also long gone. My dad worked for Xerox for over 30 years. My sister is young 30s and is, I think, at her seventh company now. And one of the reasons is obviously for new opportunities, new experiences, but also just getting bigger paychecks and everything like that as well. And it's very similar in law enforcement too. And it's going to be even harder to keep people the longer we go along. It's going to make agency going to have to make a much bigger effort to figure out why officers are leaving. And I can tell you it's not because of the money. That's when I ask my candidates why they're leaving, it's never about the money.
As Colin was speaking, I started thinking about, you were talking about change and how the generation has changed. I think from my perspective, I remember when I think my first patrol car I ever sat in was in 1995, right? So going back a few years, and how technology has also changed not only this industry, but beyond public sector. And you start to think about the new generation coming in, what are they being introduced to, right? So transparency, accountability, body worn camera, that was something that was highly resisted, I believe, in our generation, my generation, but adopted, right? Because of policy, because of incidents that have arisen over the years. Technology has allowed it to be, hey, we're going to be extremely transparent. We're going to be extremely accountable. And those are messages, but also those are tools. And actually the adoption is interesting. I've seen so many agencies go, hey, I want to make sure that I'm being captured for my wellness, my safety, or my career development. But also you brought up a good point, Colin. You brought up that there's interesting jobs now being created in public sector that are maybe even gathering the attention of some of the new folks that are looking at this career. And that is crime analytics, real-time crime center. All of the tools now that agencies have invested in communities are coming together to create a new, I would say, a virtual law enforcement position. And it's actually quite cool to see how many agencies have created new jobs that are even non-commissioned that help as a force multiplier to the road. So just wanted to share that.
That's a great point. I think this younger generation obviously is even more tech savvy than my millennial generation. And I think agencies showing the opportunities that they have. If you want to be a drone pilot, you can do that. If you want to get into the body worn camera things, and there's so much that companies like Samsung's are offering public safety agencies. And I think law enforcement agencies can really highlight the really cool new tools and resources that they have available and how officers can make that a huge part of their career. I think that's a huge selling point as well.
Colin, one of the things that you just mentioned is that as you talk with officers, it's not all about money. And so, one of the things that we wanted to talk about is how does an agency build a culture people stay for? When you talk to your client, an officer that maybe like you, that has been there 7, 8, 9, 10 years, what's the number one reason that people are leaving law enforcement agencies? I'm sure there's a variety, but if you were to put your hand on one thing, what would that be?
Number one, no doubt in my mind, is that they don't feel valued by their organization, by their leadership team, whether that be accurate or inaccurate. They from their perspective, they don't feel valued. And I still have a lot of love for my agencies, but when I left, that was how I was feeling as well. I felt like I was, being worked to death and not being really appreciated for all the effort I was putting into. And after a while, I said, I can go make a lot more money, have a lot more time off, more time with my family, and be valued more than I am right now. And that's honestly, I hear that echoed almost every single day from candidates who are just telling me that they're, have sacrificed so much for their agencies and don't feel they've gotten, the anything back in return, or not what they deserve back in return. And a lot of that just has to be with open communication. I know with my agency, there's always so much secrecy around promotional processes and who's getting promoted. And it was never an open conversation with the people putting in for promotions or for specialties. And that's, I think, a huge part of it as well. Just people just having open conversations with their officers. You may not make everybody happy, but at least explaining why decisions are being made a certain way, and not just saying, well, that's because that's how command staff wants it. That's how it's going to be. And I think that's a huge part of it. And the not feeling valued thing is really tied with communication from above. And I also mentioned in my book that, in my opinion, the two most important positions in a law enforcement agency are the sergeant role and the lieutenant role. People think it's the chief or deputy chief. Yeah, that matters as well. But if you have an agency of 1,000 people, the chief isn't going to interact with their officers every single day. The majority of the agency is going to be supervised by sergeants. And if your immediate supervisor is horrible, treats you poorly, doesn't value you, you could have the greatest chief in the world, but if your immediate boss is making you miserable, you're going to view that agency as a negative, and you're going to be miserable in your job, and that's going to push you out as well. So a big thing I always push with agencies is making sure that you're putting all your efforts into promoting the very best sergeants and lieutenants, obviously all the way up the chain as well, but those two roles are so vital. And that's where a lot of officers come to me and just say they're just fed up with, with their immediate boss, and they don't see any light at the end of the tunnel and decide, I'd rather just leave.
What's interesting, Colin, and here at Samsung, one of the things that I was just amazed by when I started working for a global multinational company, right? We had over 600,000 employees in the world. The word that keeps coming to mind that they emphasize is culture. Culture keeps people, and development of leaders. So I can't tell you how many, as a leader here at Samsung, how many annual courses that I get assigned to me to continue my development as a people leader. One thing I thought was really cool, it was my first year in a director role. My peers actually got an opportunity to rate me as a leader. What were my skill sets? Where would they measure me on a scale 1 to 5? Good being best, that kind of stuff. And then also some actual feedback and saying, hey, what's one wish you would have for Keith Redlin, and then what would be one wondering, like in terms of like, I wonder if he could do this differently. And I think it's just how they worded it, but every single year, not only my peers, but my employees rate me as a leader. I got to tell you, it's a little bit of like a bragging thing for me. I try to do, it goes without saying, but I try to work for my team. I work for Samsung, but working for my team is allowed me to have a different mentality than just I'm a boss.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree 100%. I think there's private companies are doing it, not all of them, but a lot of private sector companies are putting a huge value on culture. And I think agencies are trying. I've always kind of joked that law enforcement always seems to be a step or 2 or 5 behind other industries. And I think that's the case here as well. They're slowly trying to make officer wellness and officer company organizational culture more of a topic, but it's slow. It's a slow process. They're not, making it a huge priority. And I think that's very telling with the exodus that we've really seen in the last 5 years. I was I was the supervisor of the recruiting unit and hiring unit right during the start of COVID and during the George Floyd era, and just saw applications take a nosedive, and people resigning and retiring go up, skyrocket up. And it was just a perfect storm, mixture of what's going on in society, as well as the fact that after 9/11, agencies hired a lot of law enforcement officers. There was a huge push for public safety after 9/11. And now it's been, 25 years, just about 24 years. So all those officers who were hired right after that horrible event are now retiring as well. So it's a mixture of young people leaving and older people leaving as well. And it's just created a perfect storm for agencies. And yeah, I think making good leaders is very, very important to try to fix this issue in the long term.
We've talked about culture, and I love Keith brought up culture, and you've talked a little bit about it. What makes a good culture? I mean, you've talked about some of the things, the sergeant, lieutenant, I couldn't agree more. They're sort of the risk manager of the agency. They're who we deal with on a daily basis. If you were to say, what are the top couple of things that an agency can do to create a positive culture for their employees? What would you say to that?
I think transparency is huge. Transparency from the top down and bottom up. I think showing support to your officers is huge as well. There's been numerous examples of chiefs and chairs throwing their officers under the bus pretty much as soon as an incident occurs, versus giving the right answers. Hey, let's do the whole investigation and see what's going on, and just really valuing your people and actually showing that, not just with the occasional thank you email or a Christmas time email, but really showing it in your day-to-day actions that you actually value your officers, and you want to give them the tools and resources to be successful, and you want them to be happy in their lives, both in your agency, but also outside of it as well. And I think for the longest time, it was all about the good of the agency, the good of the agency. Yes, that's very important. But if your people aren't happy and they're not happy at home and their personal life, it's gonna swell over into their professional life as well. So I think those are all just vital to make a real culture that values its people. And I'm sure Pete has a lot of examples from Samsung too, what they've tried to do to create a good culture there.
Yeah, that's great. What about technology? It seems to me this newer generation, they basically have been born with some kind of a smartphone or something in their hands. How does that relate to retention, recruiting, that whole aspect? Could you just talk about technology a little bit?
Absolutely. It's a great conversation, a good topic. When I was in my position, my sheriff and upper leadership, we're all had been in law enforcement for 20 or 30 years. And I remember when I was in that role, we're trying to be really creative with our recruiting efforts, trying to use technology to our advantage. And they kept going back to wanting to do ads on, the local news, on cable and things like that. And I told them, like, listen, I'm probably the only person in my friend group that actually still has cable. Like, no millennial, no Gen Zer anymore has cable. Since then I've cut the cord myself. And the fact that agencies are still trying to do most of their ads on, cable TV, on Facebook. No offense to Facebook. My wife is a teacher. Not a single one of her students in ninth grade is what she teaches. She hasn't had a student in, I think, like 7 or 8 years that has a Facebook account. So I'm seeing agencies dump. I know how expensive Facebook ads are because I've done them myself for other things in my business. They're dumping money into Facebook ads. And again, there's no young 20-year-old on Facebook to see those ads. So they were just wasting that money. Of course, now agencies are trying to do some more on TikTok and Instagram and things like that. So I think they're again, steps behind. They're slowly figuring out that they have to adjust how they're doing things. And showing an ad on your cable, on your local news isn't going to get anybody's attention besides someone who's like in their 60s or something nowadays. I always shake my head as well when I talk to agencies about their recruiting efforts, how few agencies are using LinkedIn as an example. LinkedIn is the largest professional networking platform in the world. People are on there to try to find jobs. And most agencies do not use LinkedIn whatsoever. When I got into my position, I created our agency's LinkedIn page. Within the first 2.5 years or so, 40% of our candidates that we received every year came to us through LinkedIn. That was just me posting at LinkedIn for free. And agencies aren't using it. They're dead set on using Facebook for some reason. No one's going onto Facebook to try to find a job. But
Right.
people are going onto LinkedIn to try to find
And if
jobs.
they are, maybe they're not the right candidate. Maybe, I don't know.
I was just going to say, just echoing what Colin was talking about Facebook. I'm basically a girl dad of, girls ranging from 1 all the way to 31, and even none of them have Facebook anymore. I think they have it just to collect pictures, and my wife and I post on Facebook. But I got to tell you that, as technology changes, so do the platforms, and I think you did a really good job, Colin, talking about that, because LinkedIn has become an amazing weapon for us in the private sector as well to find talent, connect. I think that's exactly how I connected with you a year ago. Yeah, just kudos to you exploring different platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think agencies need to do a bigger push on hiring talent that are exceptionally good at creating content. Even though agencies may not want to be in the content creation game, it's what's required nowadays to really get attention. Making informational videos, making quick shorts where you talk about what you have to offer, getting your eyeballs out there to the right people. And I feel like so many agencies, including my own, they're pulling deputies or officers off the street and telling them, "Oh, you're a PIO now," even though they have no background whatsoever in social media marketing or anything else like that. And then they're wondering why their strategies aren't working. Well, you're putting someone there who has no background in it. You need to start hiring people, even if it's young 20-year-olds who have great natural talent at tech, bringing them in and having them help you create a real strategy and a long-term strategy too. Not just think of one video, put it out there, think of another one, put it out there. Think a year in advance and start drawing out the content you want to create and what you really want to highlight. highlight a day in the life of an officer, highlight the benefits, highlight the specialties, highlight the fact that you only work 15 days a month. There are so many things you can highlight in very short videos that don't have to cost a lot of money and aren't that hard to create. But again, you're putting, unfortunately, some 50-year-old deputy in that position who never has worked a camera before in his life, and then you're wondering why the pictures are grainy and there's no videos. And there are agencies out there that are
Well,
doing amazingly well, and there's agencies out there that are well behind, and I think that's a huge part of it too.
I was just going to say, I would call it, wrapping this up is how do you humanize the badge, right? And these agencies that have done a good job connecting with kids, connecting with community, highlighting an officer of the week, asking them rapid fire questions, just kind of humanizing them beyond just, hey, you're a police officer and we understand your role, but you're also somebody, right? And you're a family, you're serving the community, but there's a different side to the badge as well. So I've seen a lot of good agencies do that. But I also wanted to make a comment about this technology piece, because not just because of Samsung, but also in crimes related to technology, right? So if you're a school resource officer today, you cannot avoid the investigation of Johnny did this, Sally did that on this platform. They sent me this bad picture. They're bullying me here, and you have to learn to navigate the different platforms and traps that are out there now when it comes to technology, especially in the social world, whether it's Discord and the other different platforms that are out there. So it's become its own mess, I believe, at the K through 12 space. Obviously, as you go up the chain there, and it gets more complicated when you're doing, more serious crimes. But if you're an SRO, if you're looking at doing any of that, your mobile device and how you relate to the current, kids or the community is really critical. And that's one thing that, us at Samsung, we always talk about this is how do we maintain relevancy? Every 6 months, you have to, check yourself and go, how are we relevant today? Because 6 months ago, things were different.
I love that. I think that's one thing that agencies aren't doing. They might think of a cool new thing to do, but then they'll be stuck in that for the next 4 or 5 years. When in reality, they should be thinking every 6 months, revisiting, are we still doing what's relevant? Because nowadays, attention spans are, 10 seconds long. And if you're doing the same thing for 4 or 5 years, you're going to lose the impact of it. So I think that's great what Samsung is doing. And I think agencies should be doing the same thing, is always looking ahead and seeing what they can do to better reach their audience, better reach their citizens, and humanize the badge, like Keith said too, is such a huge part of it. Unfortunately, most citizens, when they think of law enforcement, they think of what they see on the news or in very short clips of officers, usually the ones doing something poorly, and just showing that officers are normal people that have normal lives and experience things the same as everybody else would go a long way to humanize the badge and hopefully also improve the relationship between law enforcement and the public. And when that gets improved, they'll also see an increase of applications as well. Because for the most part, who would want to join a profession that's universally hated? Not that I think law enforcement is, but if you can make the relationship between the public and law enforcement stronger, more people will see it as a viable option for themselves or for their kids. Because I'll be honest with you, the way the current climate is, I just had a son 6 weeks ago. I'm not sure if he was 21 years of age, if I would want him to go into law enforcement. And I hope that 21 years from now, when he is old enough, if he wanted to, that the climate will have changed. And that's something that I could actually encourage him to go into. That's the long-term play as well that recruiting is. Recruiting shouldn't just be short-term. Let's throw up a quick ad and see what we get. It needs to be a long-term strategy as well. We need to think 5, 10 years in the future and build strategies that really not only strengthen recruiting, but also strengthens just the relationship between us and our citizens.
In the last couple minutes that we have left, I want to ask you this question. So, no matter how well the agency takes care of its officers, how good the leadership is, how good the sergeant is, sometimes it's just not a good fit. And we get that. And so what would you say, what's a key takeaway for an officer that's feeling maybe burned out or undervalued or just talking about leaving the profession? What would you say to that officer?
Yeah, this is one of my life's passions now, is helping law enforcement officers, transition to the private sector. Not that I want to see people leave the profession, but I know at some point or another, everyone's going to have their time where their time in law enforcement is done. And the big thing I always stress is that law enforcement officers have so many transferable skills that translate phenomenally well to the private sector. I think so many officers think that, well, I was a cop for 20 years. Now I have to go into security role. I need to stand at a desk or maybe get into fraud investigations with a bank or insurance company. Those are great roles. 100% go after those if you want to do those. But there are a lot of cops that they've been there and done that. They want to move on to something totally different, but they wrongfully think that they can't possibly do anything else. And that's so wrong. I've seen cops do very well in recruiting, in tech, in a whole number of different industries. And it's all just about how you articulate your skill set. Because it's just like articulating the elements of a crime on a report or during a court case. You just need to articulate your skill set and your experience in a way that civilians will understand. And I also stress about starting the process early. The private sector job market right now is horrible. Every single opening right now is getting about 300 or 400 applications for one opening. It's kind of how law enforcement was 20 or 30 years ago. And most officers think that, oh, I'll have no problem because of my experience. And unfortunately, they'll retire and find out pretty quickly that it's a rude awakening, unfortunately. So start the process early, but also know that your experience is very valuable. And you can certainly reach out to me at any time if I can help.
If you're feeling that itch, or you're at the point where you're like, hey, I want to look at, migrating to the private sector, start early, like Colin has suggested. But understand, one of the critical elements that you've learned in your law enforcement career is collaboration, relationship development, and build those relationships now. Start thinking about your passion. What do you enjoy in your private life that would transition well into the private sector, and start reaching out and build that LinkedIn profile, because that becomes your digital footprint of who you are, the experiences that you carry. And I couldn't, agree more. What Colin had shared was there's so many transferable experiences, and just to name a couple, professional communicators, heavily detailed, and like I mentioned, collaborations. One of the best guys on my team, former lieutenant with Carter County Sheriff Department. That man can write a detailed business report like no one's business. Like I always excited when you guys know him as Amos, but I get excited whenever I get to present something Amos put together, because there is not a missing gap anywhere in his detailed business report or his monthly overview reports that he shares with us. And I love that. I love the fact that the detail is there and the passion is there. So I just wanted to say, hey, this has been great reconnecting with you, Colin. Scott, thank you for hosting us today as well in this platform. I just want to say that, Samsung is excited about constantly leaning into this vertical, not only from a technology standpoint, but also how do we give back? How do we connect the dots for you guys? So please feel free to reach out to me as well. If there's anything that I can do to talk to you about for the badge to the boardroom, Colin and I are definitely here to help. So, but back to you, Colin.
Colin, thank you again so much. Just what's one key takeaway that our audience can remember as it relates to this topic? What would you say to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's just that the law enforcement community, it's really a family, and I think we need to treat it that way as well. That the people we bring in become a part of our family, and we need to care about them from the very moment they walk in our doors, through the academy, through FTO, through their entire career. But then we also need to make sure that they're successful in their life and career after law enforcement. And that's where I've seen a pretty big pushback from law enforcement leaders as far as helping their officers transition to the private sector. Obviously, recruiting retention is a huge problem and needs to be addressed. But we also need to make sure that our heroes, as I call them, once they're done serving, whether it be after 5 or 35 years, that they have all the resources and knowledge to prepare to transition to the private sector. And that's what I've really dedicated my life to now, and trying to give resources from my book to my coaching services, and now the Heroes Academy, which is coming out later this month. There's just so much that I want to offer our law enforcement officers and our law enforcement communities, between recruiting and retention, but also helping them transition to the private sector. But just know that you're valued, whether you stay in law enforcement or whether you want to go to the private sector. You're valued, and we appreciate your service and everything that you've done for our communities. So just stay safe out there and reach out anytime if Recruiting Heroes or I can help. And same thing with Keith as well. We're definitely here for anyone who's worn the badge and needs to talk or needs help. We're always here to be a resource for them.
Colin, if someone wanted to reach out to you, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, LinkedIn is where I live on LinkedIn. I post on there entirely too much, but I'm on there. It's Colin Whittington. You can email me at colin.whittington@recruitingheroesllc.com. You can also go to our website, which is recruitingheroesllc.com. those are the main ways to get in touch with me. I'm on Facebook and Instagram, but honestly, I hardly post there at all anymore. It's just I've never been really good with those platforms. LinkedIn just kind of aligns better with who I am and what I'm trying to do. So on there, and yeah, if anyone wants to jump on a call just to have a conversation about their career, where they want to go, I have a lot of phone calls these days, which I love doing. I love hearing stories. So reach out to me at any point in time.
Thank you both, Colin and Keith. This has been great. Appreciate you sharing your experience, and a special thanks to Samsung for putting this thought leader together. Recruiting and retaining quality officers isn't just a staffing issue; it's also a public safety issue, and your insights are invaluable to this discussion. Today's episode of Mobile Technology Spotlight was sponsored by Samsung Electronics. Stay safe, stay strong, stay connected.